Hi, folks. David Jameson here, one half of ContaCast. The other half, Kat Boyd, is heading up our election coverage for the Scottish elections. So sadly, she won't be with us for the next few weeks, and you've been left with me, the poor relation. But I will try and make good that shortage by bringing in some interesting guests. Today we have Catherine Liu, who is a professor of film and media at University of California, Irvine, the author of many interesting books and articles, but most especially Virtual Hoarders, The Case Against the PMC, the Professional Managerial Class, a book that's causing a lot of waves in America and elsewhere in its discussion of contemporary class and the contemporary left, the relationship between social class and the contemporary left. So first of all, Catherine, thanks very much for coming in on this call from abroad.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be here.
And to help me in this discussion on this book is James Foley, who reviewed the book for conta.co.uk. You can go and read his review of the book there. James, thanks for being Cat for the week.
I feel like I'm going to be an entirely inadequate replacement, David, but I'll do my best.
Great stuff. Catherine, let me introduce the issues in your book for, I suppose, a Scottish and a British audience, because at the moment it's quite it's a debate that's happening a lot in the American left, from what I can see from over here. It's got a lot of tongues wagging. But the context, I suppose, is kind of an American context in the sense that, like with Corbynism in Britain, you in America are in the aftermath of the Bernie Sanders experiment and the mass movement, that came in the wake of Bernie Sanders and his challenge to be the Democratic nominee. And as sometimes happens in the aftermath of a mass movement, there is a more or less healthy debate about the contours of the movement, what went right, what went wrong, and so on. And it seems to me that this is part of quite a healthy debate, where we are discussing what are the class forces involved in the contemporary left, what are perhaps some of the limitations in the reach of the left into wider parts of the population. Do you think that that's the backdrop to the argument you're making here? Where do you see this argument as coming from?
That is a really good point, and it is the backdrop, partially because I was able to make the argument because Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020 showed that socialist ideas could find a mass following in the United States. Despite all the tendencies of socialist and left organizations. I mean, James's review was really funny about just this historical point of view of how eccentrics, sort of would join the socialist left because they thought this was the place where they could express themselves in the UK in the early part of the 20th century. But I had seen the left sort of be completely decimated by Reagan and then, Clinton and the neoliberals. And what it had degenerated to, in my view, was a kind of niche subcultural attitude towards left politics. And when Bernie Sanders articulated so powerfully in 2016 and 2020 the need for universal programs, the need for universal solidarity, I really thought like my commitments, my political commitments, my commitment to a kind of the universal power of capitalism and the commodity form were being articulated at a very, very, popular mass level. And it was compelling to millions and millions of Americans. So that was really fantastic. But in the wake of his defeat and then Biden's rise to power, which actually at this point, I have to say, he's done very encouraging things, Biden. So let's just put that aside for a moment, even though, the Democratic Party to me is a completely corrupt and pointless institution at this point. But what happened was what I think happens when the left sees itself, set back is that because it's so dominated by the professional managerial class cultural ethos, it doubles down on niche causes, and it doubles down. I'm not even going to say identity politics, because I've realized that identity politics is not politics, it's identity protocols. So it doubles down on identity protocols, and it loses its way. It loses its way because it's so dominated by aspirational professional managerial class people, white collar workers, and college graduates. Because there is a huge divide now in the United States between those who have gone to elite liberal arts or private colleges, or more prestigious public colleges like universities like Berkeley, or to a lesser degree UC Irvine, where I teach, because it's much more popular in nature, I would say, less exclusive. Like the most exclusive colleges now are churning out these aspirational PMC members who are enforcing a code that is anti-Marxist, that is anti-socialist, anti-materialist, and anti-class analysis. So some of the after 50 years of not being able to talk about class since 1968, and only being able to talk about identity, our actual ability to do class analysis in the United States is so atrophied. Like, one of the funnier critiques of me in my book is that, like, here she is pretending to be poor, Catherine Liu pretending to be poor because she's talking about class. And I was like, first of all, I never pretended to be poor, and second of all, are you so addled by identity politics that you feel like only poor people can talk about class, like only women can talk about gender? No, the dynamic of class analysis is something that Marx brought into the foreground of historical materialism, as you guys know. And he was poor, but he was from a petty bourgeois family. So, and what he saw, and Engels was not poor, and what he and Engels saw happening in northern England was filtered through class analysis. They were not like woke, saying only workers can talk for themselves. They saw what the working day was doing to the British working class. And so I'm not saying like I have that kind of insight that they did, but I do feel like I am continuing a legacy, because there was a huge truncation in my education, my growing up, in terms of class analysis. And now, because in many ways I'm also protected by tenure, I'm protected by age, I'm protected by gender, and because I'm an Asian American, I feel like I need to talk about this. And it will make me vulnerable to all these sorts of critiques, whatever, these low grade critiques. But I feel like we have to insist upon the class dynamic and the notion of class struggle and class contradiction as the motor of history. And we've seen that class war that the PMC has waged against the working classes has been the motor of history in terms of the neoliberal turn and the destruction of all the social democratic supports that were put in place in the United States after the Second World War. I mean, I know the situation is different in the UK and EU, so you should ask me questions and I'll try to respond. But one of the ways in which I thought about the professional managerial class as an intermediate class that the Ehrenreichs talk about in 1977, intermediate between the capitalists and the working class. And they said they're very ambivalent about the working class, but they're hostile to capitalism. This is 1977. The PMC is no longer hostile to capitalism and capital. It has totally assumed the point of view and the interest of the capitalists, and it is more and more hostile, not ambivalent. It's purely hostile to the working class.
So I want to go on and ask you for a kind of a slightly deeper definition of the PMC and how you see that as different from other types of middle classes that has been understood historically in capitalism. Before we get there, I just wanted to acknowledge the really good point you make about, because I get this as well. People say, well, you say that you're on the side of like working class politics or class politics or something like that, and yet you are middle class. So they even now think that class politics is a form of identity politics. They think that you're making claims on the basis of your own identity. That's how pervasive that political reform has become. But on the PMC, I mean, I'll tell you where I came from on this question, which is maybe a slightly unhelpful place, which is one of kind of anti-Americanism, which is, I thought, when I heard the phrase PMC, I thought professional managerial class, that is a phrase for middle class, because Americans don't have a phrase for middle class. So I remember years ago, I was watching one of Michael Moore's documentaries about Flint. And he talked about how his dad, who was a car worker, was middle class, a member of the American middle class. And I remember thinking that he's classically working class. He's a car worker. So in America, traditionally, better off parts of the working class were called the middle class. And there wasn't really a phrase for professionals, for managers, for bureaucrats, for cultural, higher up cultural workers and things like that. So, I mean, does the phrase PMC simply fill that gap in American language?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So it might, but it really is distinguished by the fact that the United States exported its notion of higher education to the world after World War II. And it doubled down on the British notion of meritocracy and created it as a global hegemon. But let me go back a little bit. And so I think that's what distinguishes the PMC. It is hegemonic and imperialist. But but to go back a little bit to say, is it just another term for the middle class? No, it's really formulated along the lines of the college credential or the professional credential. Because you could have, like in Flint, a blue-collar worker who made, let's say, the equivalent of $100,000 a year. They were the labor aristocrats, right? But they didn't have a college education. So in that sense, they were déclassés still. And that gap now has grown exponentially between those who are college educated and those who are non-college educated. So at the turn of the century in the United States, 19th to 20th, that's how old I am, the turn of the last century, the PMC made up a tiny, tiny part of the American population. Let's say they were doctors, lawyers, or even in intelligentsia, right, who had gone to college. I would say like numbers that, left-wing sociologists like C. Wright Mills showed were they made up 3% of the American population. As American capitalism has gotten more complex, as it needs managers and professionals more, that class has expanded exponentially. Today, it occupies about 25% of the workforce, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The way that I like to define this class is it's a class which has jobs that require the college credential, and it is a class in which your work is not physical. Nothing you do has to do with your body. And I know that this is very commonsensical for European leftists, but it's not in the United States. So even if you made like $100,000 a year as an air condition repairman, which is incredibly dangerous and also very, physically intensive in California, at least, you are not a member of the PMC. And I think that takes a lot of confusion out of the class itself. So a lot of classical Marxists said to the Ehrenreichs, this is just the petty bourgeoisie. This is just petit bourgeois. But the petit bourgeois are also, intermediate classes. So the petit bourgeois, I would say, in the United States are like small business owners, farmers, people who were self-employed. This is like the myth of the American yeoman, right? That class is also in real trouble because you have all these big box stores moving in, the mom and pop shops are closing down, the family farm is being sold to Archer Daniels Midland because of, the monopoly on GMO seeds. That mythical yeoman petit bourgeois class in America is in trouble and shrinking. The PMC is more and more powerful, and it is an intermediate class that does not own enough capital to live on its rent, on its interest, but it completely identifies with financialization and speculation. So its most elite segment also is not attached to any notion of place. Like, this is also a feature of the class, is that you can take your job and go anywhere and do it. So the pandemic is really brought out this, stark difference between the people who actually work in a place, trapped in a place, have to be confronting other people, and people like me who work in front of a computer. Somebody emailed me and said they thought it was the email jobs, like people who can work by email. And, I'm doing distance teaching, but I also handle a lot of emails. So this class really is protected from a number of things that really affect the worker in a really profound way and damage the worker sort of in the classical Marxist sense of exploitation. So, which is not to say that PMC work does not damage you. It damages you psychologically, ideologically, and politically. But it is a class that is very that might be stratified now, because at the lower end of it are unionized credential workers like the National Nurses Union. They're much more radical than the top level of the PMC, or teachers unions, for example. Uneven levels of progressiveness, but teachers came out and went on strike 2 or 3 years ago in a very, very powerful way. And so they are at the lower end of the PMC, but their work requires a credential. Now, with nurses, though, they are physically, they have to lift patients, so they're in this very liminal position with regard to the class difference. So that's what I would say is another definition of the PMC that I would like to cite that I find very useful, because C. Wright Mills also talks about, and Krakauer too, talks about how proud the lower level clerks were in Weimar Germany and in post-war America, because they could work in offices. And even though they were at the very bottom of large bureaucracies, these clerks and these office workers could, and they made low salaries, they could enjoy the amenities of office work. So the PMC, contemporary PMC today, I would say, are people who can work in air conditioning. And part of their job is to manage other people. So I think it's really important to have that, to separate out the professional, the managerial, and the question of class, and to say that this class is distinctive within American imperialism, because American higher education has become an $1 trillion industry. Everyone pursues prestige. No social democratic country, England, I'm going to put aside. But so, for instance, in Germany, because the universities are virtually free, there is no hierarchy of prestige. Germans are less, go to college now at an instance less than in the United States, but it's because they have a really healthy, functioning technical school and apprenticeship program for highly skilled craftspeople and to train people in industrial production. So we don't have that anymore at all in the United States, except for, large public universities like the one that I work for. But we've exported this model of prestige abroad. And so it's no accident that the sort of Asian elite all want to come to the United States and go to college. I think they do with the UK too, because the UK has, is exporting prestige. Yeah. Is exporting its prestige industry of a higher education to the rest of the world. But this pursuit of prestige, this pursuit of the credential that has become more and more of a zero-sum game, but that supposedly will guarantee you a place in this class, this is a very particular American export that has been the imprimatur of American imperialism since the Second World War. So you have all these guys from Harvard or Chicago who go around to Chile, and they after Allende is put down, and they try to put in austerity and neoliberalism there. But the right-wing Chileans are really proud, because they're like, they're from the University of Chicago, they're from Harvard, they're going to come and murder us, murder our economy, but they're so smart. And so that's how I'm doing a cartoon version of American imperialism, but that's how it works in the Cold War era.
We'll have to take you up on one point there, Catherine, because air conditioning is really not a big factor amongst the Scottish professional elite, I have to say. So many might not appreciate exactly what it is you're talking about there. I know you have visited Scotland, so you'll appreciate what I'm on about. What I did want to, I completely agree with you about all academics here, and I work in higher education, do have an unhealthy obsession with liberal America. They take all their metaphors increasingly from liberal America, even when they're completely inappropriate for assessing their own societies for which they are part. I recall Alex Hochuli in one of our interviews mentioning that in South Africa, Black South Africans have started referring to themselves as minorities, for instance, or at least the ones that have had a higher education have started to do so, purely on the basis that they learn everything from America, and that is increasingly part of the culture. One of the points I wanted to also maybe pay a bit more attention to is the politics of some of this, because it seems to me that while all of what you're saying is true, I mean, particularly in a sort of high era of neoliberalism, that perhaps since 2008, what you've seen is an overproduction of graduates, and many of them pushed downwards, either into other parts of the economy, or for individuals such as myself, I'm in officially a postdoctorate position, but nonetheless at the same time, I'm probably not paid that much more than an average worker in the economy. And so that level of differentiation is gone. Now, many of us who were initially optimistic about this scenario probably thought, well, many of these people are going to form unions, they're going to join the left. And in a lot of ways they did. But could you also talk about some of the potential drawbacks that have happened since then? Because as one person put it previously, we've seen them drawing together a bit economically, but it's also seen some processes of increased cultural differentiation, where younger elements of the PMC are increasingly determined to differentiate themselves from the working class on a cultural level.
That's a really good question, and it was one of the points that George and I disagreed on when I went on BungaCast, because he saw things sort of more from your point of view, in which he saw this sort of, let's say, like an entire generation of young academics or aspirational academics sort of facing the fact that there are no jobs, or there are no good white-collar jobs for them. There is no place for them in intelligentsia, in the institutions that had previously nurtured the intelligentsia. And he thought that the doubling down on identity protocols would be the ways in which this class sought to distinguish itself from the working class, because even though its prospects might be as poor as the working class now, it has to distinguish itself from people who make the same money that they do, but have no college degree. And I thought, that's such a bleak image, because I was hoping that when people see that there is so little reward for them to obey the sort of liberal and neoliberal ideologies of the class, and they would find solidarity with each other and with the working classes, at least, and criticize capitalism in a more profoundly, mobilizing way. And, you've caught me at a weird time, because I've just been like Twitter mobbed and Twitter hated, but I feel like, okay, so those people who are very online, they are the ones who are very aspirational, and they will toe the line with regard to these cultural differentiations and distinctions that you were just mentioning, James. But on the other hand, the people who are not very online, the people who are emailing me, and this is just purely anecdotal, of course, or who are writing from all over the world, are saying, like, this is that class is the category that they were missing from their own understanding of their alienation from work and their alienation from the labor processes and what they've seen happening around them. So on that level, I do feel like there is a mass consciousness about what is happening. It's just not organized by a left. And then we have this cultural left that is ready to jump down your throat if you don't obey its protocols. And if you're a vulnerable, young, aspirational academic, or someone who wants to enter the liberal professions, as the Aronnax called the PMC's purview, then you are going to have to toe that line about all of these identity protocols in order to distinguish yourself from the non-college educated person. And it is a kind of the kinds of thought conformity within the sort of aspirational class is partially enforced out of fear and partially enforced out of this like false consciousness identification. I mean, of course, I wish that there were like an easy solution to say, you know, wake up, like the 1920s or 30s left would say to the masses, like wake up and stand up. But right now, there are the precariousness of middle class life and the lower echelons of the PMC make that very, very difficult.
Catherine, I want one of the sympathetic readings that I've heard from someone who read your book and liked it, but also had some points that they wanted me to raise. I guess what their position was basically, well, of course, the PMC that you're talking about are probably the most annoying class. They're the people who, you know, when we look at what they're saying on social media and so on, some of the virtue hoarding behavior that you've spoken about, of course, that's very, you know, it's pesky, it's annoying, it's a number of other things. But on the other hand, in terms of our overall analysis of society, the real enemy remains capitalism, which is a different class entirely. In Scotland, it's largely an overseas class that owns and controls our assets. But they would argue that perhaps we should be focusing on what unifies. Potentially, I mean, I looked at the statistics, and it's probably about a third of people work in either professional or managerial jobs in the United Kingdom. So then we've got possibly another 60 odd% of people who are working class in one way or another, and in others we might be traditionally petty bourgeois and so on, right? So is the focus not on unifying that 99%? And if not, what is the need for critiquing this particular professional fraction? Maybe you could talk a bit about the differentiations perhaps that happen in American politics with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and so on. Because I know a lot of these debates were very live in America in a way that they weren't quite as live, I think, or as differentiated within the European left.
Okay, so maybe I will talk about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren perhaps at another moment, but I want to talk about Prince Harry and his joining a Silicon Valley startup called Better Up. And one of the things I want to say is that in the United States, at least, and I'm not sure about the UK, but the capitalists like Bill Gates, like Mark Zuckerberg, like Warren Buffett, they all, and even Jeff Bezos, they like to advertise their sort of puritanical PMC Horatio Alger stories. Like, I was just really hardworking and smart, and I never spent a lot of money because that's like a vulgar working class way of consuming. And that's how I made $500 gazillion or $500 trillion, whatever. So I would say that the capitalist class in the United States, especially since Silicon Valley has taken over the real obscene accumulation of wealth and hoarding of actual wealth, is a class that is actually incredibly deferential to PMC values. And that's why I wanted to say, let's take Prince Harry for a moment, like the woke prince. He needs to have a job. And he's entering what I think is a very professional managerial class situation where he, Better Up is a coaching firm that is online and motivates workers, right? And it's supposed to be like therapeutic and matches you up with the coach. Coaching is a completely business-oriented way to motivate white-collar workers who are depressed and anxious. And this is the kind of organization that your aristocrat, a young man who should just go and spend his ill-gotten wealth in silence somewhere in a moldy castle, perhaps in Scotland, and stay the fuck out of our view, is now participating in a PMC-dominated culture industry. So that's why we need to criticize its values. That's why we need to isolate its values, because it is a new ruling class. Because even European aristocrats have to get jobs and assume its values. I don't know how this happened, but in the olden days, in sort of industrial capitalism, you had these decadent, wealthy over-consumptive people who, showed no restraint in their appetites or something. And today we have these like lean, mean, puritanical, ascetic types who are, demonstrating the proper use of capital and the proper use of time. How about that one? How about that one, James?
That is very, I mean, I guess it's a point we actually discussed, or David discussed in the previous podcast, because like what that I think signifies in terms of Prince Harry. I don't know how we keep coming back to Prince Harry on these podcasts, but it just, Meghan Markle just keeps coming up. I don't know what it is, right? But I think in your previous interview with Darren McGarvey, who's a sort of Scottish public intellectual who talks a lot about class, we're talking about the fact that in the olden days, the middle class of this country would have aspired to be like the British royalty, or like the British aristocracy with the country pad and the Labrador and the barber jacket and all these types of things. Nowadays, the British aristocracy and the British even royal family aspires to be a Silicon Valley sort of PMC worshipping type elite, as you say.
Case in point, then. Case in point. I mean, now you have the British aristocracy aspiring to be like a disruptor and a PMC entrepreneur.
So, yeah, I wanted to ask about this, about ideological production, basically. So, on the one hand, obviously the middle class are kind of a class of cultural producers, and they obviously have a wide ideological influence over society. But really, since the Second World War, the ruling elite has kind of moved into this ideological mode of liberal humanitarianism. Now, obviously, the ideas that emerge from kind of left-wing parts of the PMC can be more eccentric than that, perhaps, can be more kind of minoritarian and stuff like that. But isn't the PMC reflecting ruling class ideology more than it is simply, it hasn't so much colonized the ruling elite as the ruling elite has ideologically colonized parts of the middle class who might once have had more ideological independence from the capitalist system, and who might therefore have aligned themselves with the working class. That's traditionally how parts of the intelligentsia have operated, in the kind of Marxist movement and so on. Whereas now what's happening is that ethos, that general ethos, has taken on a specific form. The general ethos of liberalism, pro-capitalist liberalism, has taken on a specific form in layers of the middle class who would once have been more resistant.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'm going to just give you a historical answer and then a conceptual theoretical answer, okay? So, when worker unrest was really boiling over at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, with bloody strikes being put down by railroad companies and steel companies, you had this emergent class of maybe like media producers, like journalists or professors, who were a very small part of the American population, but they saw the depredations of the robber baron capitalism that were exercised in the United States. And people like John Dewey, people like Jane Addams, who were part of this middle class intelligentsia and who really inaugurated the progressive era in the United States, really aligned themselves with working class struggles. But I think that was a moment when there was so much real fear of social chaos, and the working class was much more powerful because it operated in solidarity with each other and created like a massive sense of social crisis. And so what you have then is, with Jane Addams, the invention of social work in Chicago with their settlement house, and with John Dewey, the invention of tenure and academic freedom within higher education, so that researchers were not beholden to, mediocre and Philistine funders of the U.S. university system. But I would say that at that moment, that progressive moment of the emergent PMC has to do with their fear of social chaos and a working class rebellion. In the during the Great Depression, there was also this massive sense of social chaos. Capitalism has been in crisis, for many decades now. By the end of the Second World War, but when you have this massive expansion of the class is rewarded by the capitalists, if you like, by the ruling elites, by expanding the university system, rewarding doctors and credentialed elites. You have the co-optation, if you like, of the PMC by the ruling classes. And so then you have this exchange of interests that take place as the PMC becomes more and more conservative, even though during the 60s it thought it was being very radical, but was fighting like a culture war against the working class and hoping to overturn Americans' cultural turpitude. And this is actually what the Ehrenreichs were condemning and defining, was the sort of PMC takeover of left progressive spaces after 68. If you want to, think conspiratorially for a moment, the capitalists realized by the end of the Second World War that it would be much better for them to reward a progressive class enlisted in a fight against communism. The Cold War is really important at that point. And then you have disillusioned members of the class, who were communist in the 20s and 30s. They're oppressed by McCarthyism, but they're also confronting the Stalin legacy in the 50s. And you have the elites of, the New York intellectuals moving from the left to the right during this period of time, when you have and it's sort of overdetermined. You have both the expansion of the PMC, its more copious rewards by a capitalist ruling elite that wants to stabilize the American social body. And then you have this deep disillusionment with what has happened in the Soviet Union. You have the hardening of positions in the Cold War. And I would say the Cold War creates all of these powerful instruments whereby the ruling elite can buy the PMC. Think tanks, universities, the media, private foundations. Today we know NGOs. All of that becomes massively corrupting to a class that did not have to align itself with the interests of the ruling elite.
I just wanted to ask, Catherine, I mean, one of the things I tremendously enjoyed about the book was the refreshing slaughter of sacred cows. And one in particular was the Occupy movement came in for some stick during your book, as did many other fringes of the far left that has emerged over the years. Now, the interesting thing for me about that is obviously we often saw these things initially as being the seeds of a new working class type of politics, the 99%, all this sort of stuff. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you think might have went wrong, and what lessons might be learned for socialists in the future?
Well, Occupy really represented, something that you evoked earlier, which was, the younger college-educated people an intelligentsia who were dropping out of this very copiously rewarded class, that I had described, and facing sort of a stark economic future and the creation of solidarity that could be possible thereof. But I think in the end, I have to admit that this class is so corrupted that the college education that we receive, the acculturation into this class is so deeply corrupt in the United States that if you have a movement that is led by college-educated progressive elites who are trained in this language, that movement will not become a mass movement. It will not understand solidarity as such. Bernie Sanders, uniquely does not represent that kind of person, but he was able to create a coalition, but he did not ever pay fealty to this language in which we are this language of pluralism, a language of multicultural diversity that was really imposed upon us during the 90s when Bill Clinton was cutting the social welfare system, but also promoting multiculturalism with the other hand. And Sanders represented someone who didn't do that. So I have no hope for this class as any kind of leader within left progressive movements. This is why the only thing we can do is sort of isolate its tendencies in order to dissolve its ideological hold on us. The other thing I was going to say to David's question earlier was that the PMC now operates as an incredible engine of ideological production to justify inequality and stratification. And part of that has to do with its very identity, because it's like, we went to college, we're special, like we learned this. So we may not have as much money as we want to, but we're just different from normal Americans. There's this hatred of the masses that is actually like more in alignment with right-wing cultural critics like Ortega y Gasset in the interwar period in Europe. There were all these right-wing intellectuals who just had like deep contempt for ordinary people, for working class people. And I think there's that in spades within this class. Like, and it's part of its cultural revolution that it feels like it successfully prosecuted in the 60s.
I think it's interesting how extreme this has become in the United States, because you always think, that what goes on in California in America will be with us in, a decade or less. I don't know if people in the British left, for example, know that a lot of the kind of civil rights movement legacy organizations, that a lot of kind of PMC kind of what appears to be kind of the ultra left parts of academia in America, for example, backed Proposition 22 in California, where you live. Like, I didn't know about this until I heard about it on a left-wing podcast. A lot of the people, like the language of intersectionality and so on, was used to back Proposition 22, which was a piece of legislation that basically made it easier to to exploit kind of Uber-type workers, platform workers. And they said things like, well, Black families like the labor flexibility that comes along with this. So they used the language of intersectionality to say, you don't understand Black culture. Black people like these looser regulations on labor. That blew my mind. I did not understand how extreme this had become, that there are now forms of kind of like racial essentialism that are being used directly to attack the working class. I had no idea of that.
I don't know that specific example, but there were I knew people who were organizing against Prop 22, like for the rights of gig workers to be defined as workers, right? So they were up against Uber, they were up against Lyft, they were up against, this multi-million-dollar campaign to misinform Californians about what it meant. And one of the things that Uber and the Silicon Valley types were able to put out there in the general population was that Uber drivers like to be contractors because it allows them to be more entrepreneurial. And this many Uber drivers voted for Prop 22, I guess. So what happened was they, on the app, during this period of time when the proposition was being debated, if you accepted a ride from Uber, you had to also press a button that said, I like Prop 22. So that's how they got the numbers to say, even our drivers like this. So this language that you would rather be an entrepreneur rather than a worker was something that they were that they had extracted out of this algorithmic interface that was oppressing their drivers to begin with. And so a lot of Californians weren't paying much attention, or who thought of themselves as progressive would see this and think, oh yeah, this is a worker supported proposition, so I'm going to vote for it. And what happened was there's something really wrong, I think, also with this with this populist mode in California of having referenda like this. Like, if you gather enough signatures, you can have a referendum. If you have enough, it actually just helps people with a lot of money, because if you can campaign and distort the decision-making process, then you can promote this kind of consensus that is just about your having marketed this idea correctly. I know that In the UK, for instance, Uber drivers are now have to be classified as workers. That's the only way you can go up against these people. It's the only way. And the whole idea of being an entrepreneur and driving your car is risible because it shows that after expenses, waiting, all this other stuff, Uber drivers actually make almost less than minimum wage. And it's because they have no other options with regard to stable employment that they're doing this job. I mean, it makes things really good if you're riding Uber as a consumer of the service. But yeah, that I did not know about the sort of racialization of the rationale. But yeah, things are, it is very extreme, and I do think it is going to be exported. And I do think like the most craven aspects of the European politician or the UK politician, the most craven of them, are getting ready to adopt this language.
Just wanted to come back to a previous point you made, because you made a critique of some of these forms of politics as being rooted, and I would agree, in elements of right-wing philosophy, essentialism, probably a degree of like the postmodern critique of Marxism and many of these other things. But on the other hand, it's probably a relatively common critique of your own work, and I'm sure we've all had this critique at some point or other, that there is a degree of what's been called class reductionism, and that this itself lends itself to right-wing conclusions. I'm sure it's a critique you've already heard. How do you feel about it?
Class reductionism? I say more class reductionism. No, okay. So once again, I want to ground this in concrete examples. I don't know if you've read Jefferson Cowie's book, "Staying Alive: The Last Days of the American Working Class." In it, he documents the fact that during the 60s and 70s, unions within themselves were fighting for the questions of identity, racism, representation, misogyny, and that there were all these unions who were actually, there was a union leader. He opens the book with this example of a union leader in United Mine Workers Union who did represent this more like enlightened view of identity of women, of minorities, and he was assassinated. His entire family was assassinated by the UAW establishment. We don't hear about these kind of inter-union struggles, and the unions were never able to realize an organic diversity because of the ways in which their power structure had been monopolized by these really thuggish, mafioso-ish types who dominated. And so today, some of the most progressive unions with regard to identity are female-dominated unions, like the National Nurses Union or the Flight Attendants Union. And there you have this very organic, coming out of workerism, an idea of the need to recognize gender discrimination or racial discrimination within unions themselves, and to sort of have that process worked out within the union itself. This kind of judging of the working class is something that the PMC loves to do, and it loves to judge the working class as somewhat as backward and reactionary and racist and everything else. So I do feel like we need more class analysis of identity politics or identity protocols itself. We need more class analysis of what happens in the struggle for union representation and unionization. I mean, I don't feel like we have enough class analysis. So I don't understand, like when people say class reductionist, my counter to that would be that class is a completely different category from gender and race and gender identity. It trumps all of them because the difference between the working class woman and the PMC woman is absolute. And the difference between but it's also universalized and transformed and can be translated into the difference between the working class African American man and the PMC African American man.
I mean? Yeah, I mean, it's a bold thing to say in the current political climate that you think that class is the primary, element of the capitalist configuration. I mean, there was an argument. I mean, I'm not in the academic sector, but I did see an argument where the leader of the UCU union in Britain, which is the largest academic union, said that anyone who thinks that class is the primary distinction in society shouldn't be in the union and shouldn't be in the trade union movement. Which, I mean, I did sort of think to myself, well, even if you think that it's wrong to assert that class has the central place in social analysis, it's probably not good for a trade union leader to say if you think that you shouldn't be in the union. So yeah, I mean, that's what was once quite obviously the widespread view on the Marxists inflected left is now considered quite a taboo comment. I mean, the opening page of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle, that's now a very controversial analysis on the left. But I wanted to ask about another aspect of what I see as kind of mass contemporary ideology and how it relates to the PMC. One of the things that I find about contemporary politics, and maybe this is a wider phenomenon, maybe you can't just make this all about the class elements who engage in this behavior. One of the most interesting elements of contemporary ideology is the sheer paranoia that accompanies politics. Now, on the right, that's obvious, but it's been there for quite a long time. Paranoia is often a political mood on the right. So, evangelicals around Trump and stuff were saying things like, if Trump loses this election, America belongs to the devil, right? But we're kind of used to that on the right. But you also had that echoed on the broad left a lot. So obviously in America in January this year, there was a mob of protesters who refused to accept the outcome of the election and attacked the Capitol, and it was spectacular and appalling and all that. But this instant consensus emerged. And to me, it was perhaps one of the strangest things that I've ever witnessed in politics. I was watching the coverage on BBC News 24, which is, of course, the most mainstream, dominant kind of broadcaster in Britain. It's the official sensible line of society. And they were saying, the American correspondent on the BBC was saying, this is the launch of a second American Civil War. Right, what we're witnessing is an attempt to overthrow American democracy and establish a dictatorship. I mean, that is how serious the language was. And I remember watching it thinking, I'm a left-wing person. I've been on lots of stupid demonstrations that and fun demonstrations that they weren't. I mean, one or two of them were quite stupid, but I've occupied university buildings and, all this kind of stuff. I know what that craziness is that's happening right now. This is not an insurrection to overthrow history's most powerful state. But on the kind of PMC ideologically inflected left, this became an absolute certainty that we had just witnessed attempted fascist seizure of power in the heartlands of the world system. But this is everywhere, this attitude. Brexit, for example, could have been viewed as a relatively common or garden global political development. I mean, Britain was once not in the European Union. Other countries in Europe aren't in the European Union. It's actually not that spectacular. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it was an interesting world historic development, but this idea quickly, I mean, some liberals in Britain refer to Britain now as rainy fascism island, and there's this whole culture of identifying everything as kind of authoritarian or fascist or a seizure of power by some shadowy corporate elite and so on. Is this related to, again, the influence of middle strata in society? Because if you look at the history of the 20th century, it's often been when middle-class regimes came to power, for example, in parts of the third world or the underdeveloped world, whatever you want to call it, the middle-class character of the leadership of those states was often what led to violence because they felt endangered by much more powerful social forces. Is it being trapped between capital and larger elements of the population, like the working class, that creates this mood of paranoia?
That's a really interesting analysis, that the sort of PMC would have this fear of the working class and fear and a feeling of powerlessness with regard to capital, and that provides the mood of paranoia in politics that comes from like the liberal center, even, which was supposed to be moderate and sensible and rational. So what you're saying is that there's a kind of irrationality that has taken over politics on both sides of this political spectrum. One of the things that I think about this particular form of irrationality has to do with, I think, the PMC's desperate need to legitimize itself as the proper lackeys and servants of the ruling class. So what you have is this idea that there are improper Americans, they are fascist, they are intolerant. We have the most tolerant and the most democratic view, and anyone who disagrees with us is actually, evil and iniquitous, and this is part of the whole cancel culture stuff. So, but the present form of this kind of liberal hysteria actually has given up on even the values of high liberalism, which has to do with tolerance of disagreement, because it's so horrified by its political other that it has to demonize its political other, and that happens on the right as well. So from a very critical theory, like Frankfurt School point of view, I would say that this has to do with just the eruption of irrationality in the deepest incompatible couple that we've seen in the politics of our times: capitalism and democracy, or American style capitalism and its ideals of democracy. That's actually incompatible at this point now, because of the depredations of the U.S. style capitalism. And this liberal elite still wants to, monopolize sort of sensible, centrist, just democratic values. It knows that they are under attack from the top, but it construes that attack as coming from the bottom. And that is just the deepest form of irrationality. And then it styles itself, and this is something I think comes from my sense of really, really not participating in Christendom or in Judeo-Christianity at all, and having this point of view completely outside of this system. And I see them as crypto-Christians, Puritans, even though they are horrified by evangelicals. The vanguard element of the PMC really sees itself as deeply virtuous, and everyone else is smeared by sin. I mean, you gave us, the Scots gave us this particular form of Calvinism and capitalism, so thank you, Scotland. But it is vicious because it justifies wealth as a form of grace. It justifies power as a form of virtue. And it is so deeply irrational, so deeply ideological, and the more it holds on to that irrationality, the more capable it is of reproducing the ideology of the hegemon.
I guess we should take this opportunity to apologise on behalf of Scotland. Maybe we owe the world reparations or something. I don't know.
Please, because
problems of virtue we have imposed. But what I was going to say in terms of and this is probably reflecting some of your own interests, clearly there has been a major shift in terms of the way that the PMC thinks and views the world, because certainly when I was first at university, the dominant creed was postmodernism if you were in culture, or it was sort of scientific, technical type view of the world. And liberalism was relatively open, right? So the classical liberal was all about tolerance and listening to a diversity of views and a sort of ironic spirit, you know what I mean? Which was there in postmodernism as well. You didn't want to take any definite moral positions on everything. You wanted to be ambivalent and ambiguous all the time and so on. And what's really developed, I think, and does seem to me this has been mostly since 2008, is this more moralized and hysterical aspect to liberalism. And also, as David and yourself have both pointed out, a tendency towards conspiracy theories. Probably best epitomized by Russiagate in America. But I think the tendency towards conspiratorial thinking is there amongst the entire elite. My own interpretation of that is that it's to do with having less purchase on the world, and having like less political sway. Because I guess if you were a centrist liberal in the 1990s and 2000s, it always seemed like everything was always going your way and everything was always going to get better and globalization was always going to make us richer. And you had the ideas and all the people in the past were an idiot, and we had discovered the way. It was the end of history, as everyone used to say. And it's that deep uncertainty that comes after that moment that they just have not been able to handle. But I think you're right in terms of the fact that their primary reflection of that, even though in a sense that they know this is untrue, they do tend to blame the masses, like, and to try and differentiate themselves from the masses, even though they know this is alienated, irrational forces are coming from, in reality, not just the ruling elite, but more the forces that the ruling elite actually represent, the forces of capital and so on, trying anything it can to try and turn a profit in an era where profits have been diminishing and the sources of potential, capitalism is, apart from anything else, regardless of its evils and its moral failings and all these other things, it's slowing down. It's not as innovative as it was, and it's not going to guarantee, therefore, a successful political order, as you say.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I wanted to add another thing about this particular paranoia and irrationality, especially with regard to the masses or the working class or even the concept of class in general, is that one of the things I really do not appreciate about left liberal attitudes about organizing or politics in general is that they're always innovating on some level, some kind of lesson like gender studies or postmodern studies that they need to teach the working class. The working class doesn't need postmodernism. It doesn't need Judith Butler. And I feel like, but and they're like really into listening. That's like a very like PMC thing, managerial thing to say now. Like if you have a racist incident in your school or in your university, you're like listening. And I'm just like, you guys should listen to people more. Just STFU and actually listen. And I don't feel like they're capable of it. And I don't really have, like, you guys have a much more global view of this, maybe more Olympian. But right now I feel like I'm just in the trenches, and I just want to fight them on these levels because I feel like the political impasse that you just described, James, is not going to be solved until we can dispel the illusion, the spell that they've cast over us.
One of the things about what you're saying there is clearly there's always this idea that, well, the working class is out there and we should listen to them because they're victims. But on the other hand, we have to be a bit cautious about this because the working class is inherently bigoted, and has all these different problematic attitudes and so on and so forth. And as you're saying, part of what is hidden in that whole analysis is that throughout much of the 19th and 20th century, the working class was always the vanguard of any progressive cause that you care to name, from anti-racism to votes for women to whatever it happens to be. And these traditions emerged very often autonomously from the working class itself. And a lot of this stuff sort of gets hidden in this whole approach to politics.
Well, what I wanted to emphasize about the PMC is that they're deeply, deeply ahistorical. And I think I wrote this in the book. They really feel like they're the most enlightened people who ever existed on the planet. They eat in the most enlightened way. They raise their children in the most enlightened way. They have sex in the most enlightened way. Everyone who comes before them is full of moral turpitude. Everyone who is not of their class is iniquitous. And that's the thing that, keeps me thinking we've got to be more focused on the class formations in all of these discourses.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's a really great conversation. We could probably talk about it for hours. I mean, I think you say in your book, that it's a provocation. You're making an intervention. It's not a totally worked out scientific study of how all this stuff fits together, but it's an argument that someone needs to start the ball rolling on, and I think you've given that a really good punt. So just finally, I mean, what do you think the future of this argument is? How do we cut through some of these problems and access a new kind of class analysis that can break the left out of its kind of ghettos and so on?
Well, one thing I hope for is that the rest of the world is less beholden to this vision of the world, the PMC, the American PMC vision, and that there can be a truly dissenting point of view. I'll tell you, among my students who really can understand and identify with class analysis are actually my students from the People's Republic of China. Now we hear PRC, they're so totalitarian, they're capitalists, but they're state capitalists and they don't know what they're doing and they just want to take us over. And there's all this paranoia and irrationality about Chinese, the Chinese economy, the Chinese student. But I'll tell you something that gives me perhaps different, like more hope, is that I'm, educating a lot of these upper middle class kids who their parents send out to the United States to study. And they are so open. I would say like there's a core of, they've obviously heard class analysis very much, but they're surprised, they're open, they're completely mobilized by this idea that we can talk about class within a context that isn't the official Chinese Communist Party sanctioned context, but they totally recognize the language. They are not burdened by all of this like liberal pluralism or postmodernism. They understand what is happening. They understand what happened to China, the class divisions, the rural urban divide, and that to me is very, very hopeful. They also make up like 1.3 million people. I hear that there are more people in the Chinese Communist Party than in the British Isles. I'm not sure if that statistic is correct. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with the Chinese regime, and yet here is a group of people who haven't been inculcated by this anti-class rhetoric and for whom this analysis resonates. Now, within the UK, the Anglo-American context, I feel like there are more people now who are emboldened to criticize the PMC worldview. And this gives me great hope in some ways, although I probably like too much of a Pollyanna because I do live in California and I should probably adopt the more pessimistic point of view that George Hoare adopts. But for now, I just feel like in an ethical position, I feel like there are always going to be more working class people than PMC people. There's always going to be alienation. The commodity is a universal form. Exploitation is totalizing. And therefore, because we're right, we just have to keep insisting upon this. And the arc of history will bend this way, perhaps with results that we do not like, as in, the election of Trump. But it still is a sign of the rejection, of a mass rejection of PMC values in 2016. I mean, it was devastating and terrible for many reasons. But if Hillary Clinton had won, I would have felt like, the liberal utopia that James, you described of the 1990s, or dystopia, if you like, of the 1990s, had been fully realized, and that we were truly living under a world where there was going to be no room for dissent. And I think the same thing happened with Brexit. It's like, you guys think you rule the world, you think centrists rule the world. Well, actually, they don't.
Catherine, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Could you tell everyone how to get access to your book?
You can buy it at the University of Minnesota Press website. It is also open access and available on the Manifold website.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Catherine. And thanks very much, James, for joining me for this podcast. And to all our listeners, stay tuned for some more guests and for election reportage from Kat. But yeah, thanks very much.